one other thing I'd love to tease out, because we're talking about this as being on a spectrum and that is a personality style, is that every time I talk to you, I start to wonder, oh shit, do I have narcissistic personality style? Is this something in everybody? Is it normal to worry that you are narcissistic? Does it mean you're narcissistic if you think you're narcissistic?
So a lot of people grapple with this. And it's always, I always say, the ones who are grappling and worrying that they're narcissistic usually aren't the ones who are narcissistic, right? Remember, no one thing that I mention, the entitlement or the grandiosity or the arrogance or the empathy deficits or the vanity or the selfishness or the admiration seeking, none of those by themselves define narcissism, right? A carrot isn't soup. A carrot is a
Okay.
carrot.
Okay.
It might be something in a soup, but by itself, it's a carrot. By itself, arrogance is arrogance. When you put it in there with the chicken and the broth and the celery and the stuff, now you got a soup, right? So we have to remember that you got to have the whole soup. I personally, Mel, and this is a little bit controversial, I don't believe in healthy narcissism. I know some people use that term. I'm not a fan because by definition, narcissism is unhealthy. So
Why is it unhealthy?
it's unhealthy because it puts you at odds with other people. It harms other people. And here's where it gets interesting. If somebody has a personality trait that in the world, the way it's organized now, is more likely to make them more successful, more wealthy, narcissistic people are more likely to get the romantic partners. They're more likely to be in leadership. All the things that we think are success, narcissistic people have. So you think, sign me up. The problem is this whole stuff that's narcissism harms other people. I, as a psychologist, and I feel very grounded in this, we are a social species. We exist in social groups. That something that harms that connective tissue is not healthy for a human being. I don't care if you have a lot of money. And so I don't believe in healthy narcissism. I believe in healthy self-advocacy. I believe in healthy assertiveness. I believe in healthy sense of self. But when people stop and wonder, am I narcissistic? I really ask them, do you stop and consider how your words affect other people? Do you stop and concern yourself with the feelings of other people? Every so often putting ourselves first doesn't make us a narcissist. Telling a friend like, I can't come to your birthday dinner. I have worked 16-hour days every day this week. I love you. I'd love to take you out to dinner next week. Your friend may be mad at you. I'm not saying your friend's going to be like, good for you for your self-care.
Right.
And then you say, I am so sorry. I am aware, but I can't do this. I'm pushing myself too hard. And you really make a concerted effort to create the time with a friend. I don't consider that narcissistic.
Here's what I am thinking about right now is that if you're self-reflective and you are a reasonable, empathetic, rational human being who's doing their best, if you're in a relationship with somebody who's narcissistic, it almost seems like the default is to explain away the behaviors that you're ticking off. Oh, they're raging at this person because they're tired. Oh, they're, this way because of that. Oh, now they're being nice to me. And so how do you get to a point in your life where you can say to yourself, this is definitely somebody who has this narcissistic personality style? Is it really like looking for the entitlement piece? Because I personally have really struggled with this because I am so quick to explain away the behavior.
Okay, but here's where you can do something that I think is probably one of the greatest balancing acts that if everyone could learn this, could actually help them a lot. You can explain away the behavior and understand that they're narcissistic at the same time. One thing I talk about in the new book you referenced is this idea of multiple truths. And nowhere does that matter more than when you're in a narcissistic relationship, that multiple things can simultaneously be true. They did have a bad day at work because they didn't get the promotion they wanted, and that's what's driving their anger. The way they're treating me is unacceptable. Those two things are true.
Yes.
That person's behavior, we could explain it, again, the minutia of it, it's not acceptable. Does that make sense? Just because we can explain something doesn't make it acceptable. And I think one of the dangers of psychology is we can explain things. But we sometimes think, well, if you can explain it, then it's okay. We have to be able to hold in consciousness those two things. This is why they did it, and it is absolutely unacceptable.
I think that is the biggest breakthrough idea that I hope you listening to Dr. Romney right now take away from this. That if you look at another human being's behavior and how it impacts you, to separate yourself from that behavior, that you didn't cause it, you're not responsible for it, and just because XYZ happened, how they are erupting or how they are treating you is not okay.
And that's hard.
Yes.
That's really, really hard, because the other thing we're also taught is that, and again, the world of therapy is partly guilty for this, is what are you bringing to this interaction? What part of you, think of couples therapy. What is all of couples therapy? Well, there's two people in the room, so two people must be partly responsible. I'm like, no, not so much. And so I suppose somebody's responsible because they're standing in the room. Maybe I'll give them 5% on that. But beyond that, this idea that one person is using the other human being as their pacifier and punching bag, I can't get behind that. They're using you to regulate. You serve no more function. They don't see you as a human being. They see you as someone they can go off on. And now they've learned you ain't going anywhere. So you have to make that judgment. Is this acceptable? In fact, if we look at the work on self-compassion, Kristen Neff's work, one thing I really love about it, and I brought to bear in working with survivors of narcissistic abuse, is so many survivors of narcissistic abuse are so far down the rabbit hole of, maybe this is all I deserve, maybe I'm to blame, this is probably my fault. They've believed the gaslighting, they've internalized all the manipulation. I'll say, let's step back. I hear you. Now, I want you to take apart this episode you just shared with me, and I want you to answer the question. And by now, when the client, I know they're friends and things like, I said, would you be okay if this happened to Mary? If you watched this happen to Mary, would you sign off on this? And I'm invariably like, no, God, Mary, okay. So you have just said this behavior is unacceptable. So then we work backwards from there.
Can we talk a little bit about personality styles? How does this happen? Like, is somebody just born this way? When does personality develop? Like, how do you become narcissistic?
The theoretical focus on where does narcissism come from largely is this idea of, there's sort of two paths, Mel. One path is a path of adversity. And the path of adversity would argue that narcissism as a personality style is a post-traumatic presentation. These are kids who experienced neglect, invalidation, maybe frank physical or sexual abuse, that they really, really had a rough start. That early adversity can be one path to narcissism.
So are you saying that there is a whole field of research and belief that childhood trauma creates the narcissistic personality style?
It can.
That it literally is almost like a symptom of complex post-traumatic stress disorder?
Exactly. So here's where it gets tricky. The vast majority of children who grow up with trauma and neglect and invalidation do not develop narcissism. They may develop complex trauma. They may develop nothing at all. Anxiety, the standard presentations we'd expect. The vast majority don't become narcissistic. So you might be wondering, what's path 2?
I am.
Path 2 is the overindulgence, you're more special than every other kid. And this is really interesting. That's coming out of a young researcher named Eddie Brummelmans in Amsterdam. Really promising work. There's other folks doing similar work here in the States, but the work out of the Netherlands is what really has caught my attention. And what he writes about, and his research group writes about, is that it's this idea of telling the child not just that they're special, all kids are special, you're more special than the other kids. Basically, the indoctrination of entitlement in a child. You're the most special child. These kids, but you're the most special child. That seems to be a pathway that even in children starts to shift towards a more entitled style of thinking that then is probably going to get shaped. And who's more likely to do that? An entitled narcissistic parent. The parents aren't there to teach them how to self-soothe, how to hold their emotional states, how to be present with them. They want their kid to be a winner. You're more special. And so what we also see is sort of what I call the performing pony kind of model of where we get narcissism. The kid who's loved when they're the soccer star. The kid who's loved when they're headed towards Harvard. That kid, the success kid, that kid knows. The first time I decide not to do soccer, or if I stop getting on my toes on this ballet floor, I'm toast. And that child recognizes that they are loved for what they do and not for who they are. That is another pathway to narcissism. Those kids tend to become more of the grandiose narcissists. And Mel, I'll tell you this as a clinician, you're going to make a lot more headway with the kids with those backstories and adversity, because you can use trauma-informed methods and actually make a dent. Those grandiose kids, forget it. You're not making a dent in those people therapeutically.
Is there an age range that this happens during?
I mean, again, when we think of the core of social and emotional development,
Yeah.
a lot of this is happening prepubescent.
Wow.
Around puberty is where the baton gets handed to the peers.
Okay.
Right? That's where
So it's just like 12?
12, 13.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, that's why for parents listening to this, this is the heavy lifting from 0 to 13. Safety, consistency, emotional availability, teaching children to self-soothe, giving validity to their emotions, not making your child feel that they're loved for what they do, allowing your child to feel special as part of a world full of special people and not more special, not behaving in an entitled manner around your kids.
So I keep thinking about something that happened a week ago. We were away celebrating my mom's 75th, and we were checking into a hotel. And there was a family in front of us, and they're checking in. And Dad is kind of yelling at the staff behind the counter. It's right after a big holiday weekend. The rooms are not ready. He's blustering. Mom has got like 9-inch long nails, tap, 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 tap on her phone. The kid is in a stroller wearing a Versace sweatsuit, Golden Goose glitter sneakers. So we're talking probably a $1,500 outfit on a 3-year-old with the labels all over it. The 3-year-old is on a phone right next to them, staring at social media. And as I sit here and hear you talk about the two different lanes, and that something is getting modeled between the dad yelling, the mom ignoring, the kid all over social media at the age of 3, dressed as a billboard for designer clothes, it makes me worried about the state of society.
Yeah.
Is narcissism on the rise?
So there's the big question. Dr. Keith Campbell, he's a professor at University of Georgia. And his work on narcissism, to me, is some of the best out there. And he wrote a book called The Narcissism Epidemic back in 2012 with Jean Twenge. And they were suggesting that it was on the rise at that point. Here's what him and I were noticing. I was noticing it as a clinician. He was noticing it as a researcher. He's like, the grandiose narcissism, interestingly, is kind of where it's always been. What social media has done is it's given grandiose narcissism a sort of interesting platform and place to live. But the vulnerable narcissists, their victimhood, their anger, their sullenness, their mean comments on social media, that has shot up. Because those vulnerable narcissistic folks are seeing that other people have stuff and they don't have it. So they're seething. And all this seething we're seeing in the world is the vulnerable narcissistic people have gone off like a wildfire. And that's what the new problem is, to be quite honest. That's how I see it, is that the vulnerable narcissism is really the problem. That victimized, failure to launch, I have all these big fantasies, and why isn't everything going my way? And how come everyone else gets a lucky break and nothing ever happens for me? Angry, 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 troll, 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 mean, mean, mean. That's what's sort of on the rise. And so I think that the grandiose piece is probably, there's always been that group of people.
Right.
Here's what I don't believe. I think if you have a person with a healthy personality and they're mucking around on social media, they kind of understand the difference. Does that make sense? Like, they're able to say, like, this is fun, but I think people who already have that personality stuff churning in their adolescence, social media is the match you're throwing on the gasoline. But with no gasoline, the match is just going to fizzle out. So all this stuff, the social emotional development, the 3-year-old with the designer duds, that's the kid who that plus the social media and the messages from the world and the non-emotionally attuned parents and the parents modeling entitlement, that's the person who is going to love bomb and destroy someone's life in about 25 years.
Well, this is super helpful to have the distinction grandiose, because I think I can think of a million examples
Yes,
of people
easy.
that just display it. It's out there. I find the vulnerable narcissist that you were just talking about, this deep-seated anger
And victimhood.
and victimhood, to be really fascinating. And I can see how a deep-seated anger and victimhood then leads to this sense of entitlement that might not be displayed on social media, but then gets aimed at your family, at your friends, at your colleagues, at your loved ones. And so as somebody's listening to this, and this always happens when you and I talk, there's usually one of two reactions, which is, am I a narcissist?
Right?
And the second one is, oh my God, you're describing my dad.
Yeah.
You're describing my son. You're describing the person I'm dating. What is narcissism?
Narcissism is a personality style. Let's move the disorder piece off to the side.
Every time I talk to you, I start to wonder, am I a narcissist?